The dress in the rafters. The old barn stood like a weathered sentinel at the edge of Jake Morrison's property, its red paint long since faded to the color of dried blood. For 15 years he'd walked past it every morning on his way to check the cattle, and for 15 years he'd kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. The barn might as well have been invisible for all the attention he paid it, until the day the wedding dress fell from the rafters. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the Colorado wind was sharp enough to cut glass and the aspen leaves were turning gold on the mountain sides. Jake was leading his mare Bessie back from the north pasture when a particularly fierce gust rattled the barn's loose boards. Something white fluttered down from the shadows above like a ghost seeking the light. Jake stopped dead in his tracks. Bessie snorted and tossed her head, sensing his sudden tension. There, spread across the dust and scattered hay bales, lay a wedding dress. Even after all these years, even yellowed with age and torn in places, he recognized it instantly. The delicate lace sleeves, the pearl buttons down the back, the way the skirt had once spread like morning clouds across the church floor. Martha's dress. His hands shook as he dismounted and approached the fallen garment. The fabric felt fragile as butterfly wings between his calloused fingers. How had it gotten up there? He'd assumed everything of hers had been buried with her, or given away, or burned in one of his darker moments during those first terrible months. But here it was, as if she'd just stepped out of it moments ago. Jake knelt in the dust beside the dress, and for the first time in 15 years he allowed himself to remember. Martha Caldwell had arrived in Cedar Ridge on a Thursday in April of 1859, stepping off the westbound stage with nothing but a carpetbag and a determination that could have carved mountains. She was the new school teacher, sent by the territorial government to bring learning to the rough mining town that had sprung up almost overnight in the shadow of the Rockies. Jake had been 23 then, already making a name for himself as the hardest-working rancher in the valley. He'd claimed his land when he was barely 18, built his cabin with his own 2 hands, and turned a stretch of rocky grassland into something that could support a small herd of cattle. He was proud, maybe too proud, and he'd convinced himself he didn't need anybody. Then Martha Caldwell smiled at him across the church social, and all his carefully constructed independence crumbled like a house of cards. She was beautiful, certainly, dark hair that caught the light like silk, eyes the color of summer sky, a laugh that could make a man forget his own name. But it was more than beauty that drew him. Martha had a spirit that matched the wildness of the frontier, tempered with a gentleness that could soothe the most fractious horse or the most troubled child. "Mr. Morrison," she'd said that first night, extending a gloved hand, "I understand you have the finest horses in the territory." "Just working animals, ma'am," he'd replied, suddenly tongue-tied as a schoolboy. "I'd love to see them sometime. I grew up on a farm back in Ohio. I miss being around livestock." That had been the beginning. She'd visited his ranch the following Sunday after church, and Jake had shown her around with the nervous pride of a man displaying his life's work to the only person whose opinion truly mattered. Martha had admired his horses, petted his cattle, and listened with genuine interest as he explained his plans for expanding the herd. "You've built something wonderful here," she'd said, standing on the porch of his cabin as the sun set behind the mountain. "It must be satisfying, creating something lasting from nothing." "Gets lonely sometimes," he'd admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. She'd looked at him then with those clear blue eyes, and he'd seen something that made his heart race. "It doesn't have to be lonely, Jake." They were married 6 months later, on a crisp October morning when the whole valley seemed painted in gold and crimson. Martha had worn her grandmother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and carried west in her precious carpetbag. The ceremony took place in the little church on Main Street, with half the town in attendance, and Jake feeling like the luckiest man alive. Their first year of marriage had been everything he'd dreamed and more. Martha had transformed his bachelor cabin into a real home, with curtains on the windows and flowers in mason jars on the table. She'd helped with the ranch work too, proving herself as capable with a rope as she was with a spelling primer. In the evenings, she'd tell him about her day at the schoolhouse, and he'd share his plans for improving the ranch. Next spring, he'd said one night as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "I'm thinking of building a proper barn, big enough for the horses and the milk cows, with a loft for hay storage." "That sounds wonderful," Martha had replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Maybe by then we'll need the extra space for other things too." She'd placed his hand on her still flat belly, and Jake had felt his world expand beyond anything he'd ever imagined possible. The barn had been his gift to her and their future family. He'd spent the winter months cutting timber and making plans, enlisting the help of neighbors for the raise. It was finished just in time for spring planting, a fine structure with hand-hewn beams and a gambrel roof that would shed the heavy mountain snows. Martha had loved that barn. She'd insisted on hanging her wedding dress in the loft, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. "For our daughter," she'd said with a smile that could have lit up the darkest night, "when she's old enough to get married herself." But their daughter had never been born. Martha had miscarried in late summer, and something essential had broken inside both of them. The joy went out of her eyes, and Jake found himself working longer hours, just to avoid the silence that had settled over their home like dust. They tried to find their way back to each other, but grief had driven a wedge between them that neither seemed able to dislodge. Then came the fever. It started in town, brought in by a traveling merchant who should have known better than to come through while he was sick. Within a week, half of Cedar Ridge was bedridden. Within 2 weeks, people were dying. Martha had insisted on helping nurse the sick, despite Jake's protest. "I'm the school teacher," she'd said firmly. "These are my children, my families. I can't abandon them now." She'd caught the fever on a Tuesday. By Friday she was dead. Jake had buried her in the little cemetery on the hill above town, wearing the blue dress she'd always favored for church. He'd never even thought about the wedding dress up in the barn loft. In the weeks and months that followed, as he struggled to make sense of a world without Martha in it, the barn had become a place he couldn't bear to enter. He'd moved his horses to a lean-to he built on the other side of the corral. He'd sold the milk cows. He'd let the hay loft sit empty while he bought feed from town, even though it cost him more than he could afford. The barn had become a monument to everything he'd lost, and like most monuments, it was something to be avoided rather than visited. Now kneeling in the dust with Martha's wedding dress spread before him, Jake felt the weight of 15 years crash down on his shoulder. The dress was more fragile than he remembered, the white silk yellowed to cream, the lace torn in several places. Mice had nibbled at the hem, and there were dark stains that might have been water damage or something worse, but it was still her dress, still the symbol of the happiest day of his life, and maybe the beginning of all his sorrow. "Why now?" he whispered to the empty air. "Why'd you have to fall down now?" The wind moaned through the gaps in the barn walls, but provided no answer. Jake gathered up the dress carefully, cradling it like something alive and wounded. For a moment he considered simply burning it. It would be easier that way, a clean break with a past that had already caused him too much pain. But something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of Martha's face when she'd first put it on, or the way she'd looked when she'd talked about saving it for their daughter, the daughter who'd never been born, the future that had died with Martha in the fever-stricken autumn of. Instead of burning the dress, Jake found himself walking toward the barn for the first time in 15 years. The heavy doors groaned on their hinges as he pushed them open. Dust motes swirled in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through the gaps between boards. The space was smaller than he remembered, and emptier. Cobwebs draped the stalls where his horses had once stood. The ladder to the loft looked precarious, its rungs gray with age and neglect, but the bones of the barn were still solid. The hand-hewn beams he'd shaped with such care still held true. The craftsmanship he'd put into every joint and mortise had endured, even if the love that had inspired it had not. Jake climbed the ladder slowly, testing each rung before trusting it with his full weight. The loft was a cavern of shadows, filled with the musty smell of old hay and abandonment. But there, in the far corner, he could see the wooden chest where Martha had stored her most precious belonging. The chest was covered with 15 years of dust and bird droppings, but when Jake lifted the lid, he found that the contents had been protected by the tight seal and the oilcloth Martha had used to wrap everything. Her Bible was there, and her mother's cameo brooch, a bundle of letters from her sister back in Ohio, a dried flower from their wedding bouquet, And beneath it all, another piece of oilcloth that Jake knew contained the tiny clothes Martha had been sewing before she lost the baby. Jake sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the flood of memory. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that forgetting was the only way to survive the loss. He'd thrown himself into his work, expanded his herd, built his reputation as the most successful rancher in the valley. He told himself that was enough, that a man didn't need anything more than land and livestock and the respect of his neighbors. But sitting here in the loft where his wife had once dreamed of their future, Jake realized that all his success felt as empty as this abandoned barn. He'd been existing, not living, going through the motions of life without ever really participating in it. The other ranchers respected him, but none of them could be called friends. The townspeople tipped their hats when they saw him, but he'd never allowed any of them to get close enough to matter. He built walls around his heart, higher and stronger than any fence around his property. And for what? Martha was still dead. The baby they'd lost was still gone. All his careful isolation had accomplished was to make him as hollow and unused as this old barn. The sun was setting by the time Jake climbed down from the loft, Martha's wedding dress once again in his arms. He stood in the doorway, looking out at the ranch he'd built, the life he'd constructed from nothing but determination and stubbornness. It was impressive, in its way, but it was also lonely beyond description. For the first time in 15 years, Jake Morrison allowed himself to cry. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. Jake was up before sunrise, as always, but instead of heading straight out to check on the cattle, he found himself standing at the kitchen window, looking toward the barn. He'd brought the wedding dress inside the night before, spread it carefully across the kitchen table while he tried to decide what to do with it. In the lamplight, the damage had seemed even more extensive. The silk was brittle in places, and the lace was beyond repair. But there was still something beautiful about it, something that spoke of hope and new beginnings, and the kind of love that could transform a man's entire world. Jake made his coffee and sat down at the table, studying the dress as he sipped the bitter brew. Martha had been so excited about saving it for their daughter. She'd talked about it constantly during those precious months when she'd been carrying their child, planning elaborate weddings, and spinning dreams about the future. "She'll be beautiful," Martha had said one evening, as she carefully folded the dress back into its oilcloth wrapping. "And when she wears this dress, it'll be like having a piece of my grandmother with her. And a piece of us too." The baby had been a girl. Jake had never told anyone that, not even the preacher who'd offered words of comfort after the miscarriage, but he'd known, somehow, had felt it in his bones the same way he could sense a change in the weather or trouble in the herd. Their daughter would have been 14 now if she'd lived, old enough to have opinions about boys and dresses, and the kind of future she wanted to build for herself. Would she have inherited Martha's love of learning, or Jake's affinity for animals? Would she have been content with ranch life, or would she have hungered for the excitement of the growing cities back east? There was no way to know, of course. No point in torturing himself with questions that could never be answered. But for the first time in 15 years, Jake allowed himself to wonder. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Jake frowned, glancing at the clock on the mantel. It was barely past 7, too early for social call. He quickly bundled up the wedding dress and set it aside before answering the door. Doc Harrison stood on his porch, black bag in hand, and worry etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "Jake, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I need a favor." "What's wrong, Doc?" "It's the Williams family up on Copper Creek. Their youngest, Sarah, she's taken sick with pneumonia. I need to get up there, but my horse threw a shoe yesterday, and won't be fit to ride until the blacksmith can tend to him." Jake didn't hesitate. "Take Bess. She's sure-footed on mountain trails." "I was hoping you'd say that, but Jake." Doc Harrison paused, looking uncomfortable. "The Williams family, they don't have much. Tom's been out of work since the mine closed, and Mary's been taking in washing just to put food on the table. They can't pay me, and I suspect they can't afford the medicine Sarah's going to need." Jake understood. Doc Harrison was a good man who'd never turned away a patient for lack of payment, but even good men had bills to pay and families to feed. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. "How much?" Jake asked quietly. "For the medicine, maybe $20. For my services." Doc shrugged. Call it another 10. $30 was a significant sum, more than many men made in a month. But Jake had done well for himself over the years, and his bank account could absorb the loss without hardship. More importantly, he remembered another October, another family facing a medical crisis they couldn't afford. Martha would have helped without question. "I'll ride up with you," Jake said. "Give me a few minutes to saddle another horse." Doc Harrison's relief was visible. "Thank you, Jake. I know the family will be grateful." As they rode up the narrow trail toward Copper Creek, Jake found himself thinking about the Williams family. He knew Tom by reputation, a hard worker who'd been laid low by circumstances beyond his control, the kind of man who'd probably rather die than accept charity, but who'd swallow his pride for the sake of his sick child. The kind of man Jake might have been if things had gone differently. The Williams cabin was smaller and shabbier than Jake's had been when he'd first built it, with a roof that clearly needed repair and windows that had been covered with oiled paper instead of glass. Mary Williams met them at the door, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Oh, Dr. Harrison, thank goodness you've come. Sarah's been burning up with fever all night, and she can barely breathe." Jake stayed outside with the horses while Doc Harrison examined the child. Through the thin walls, he could hear Sarah's labored breathing, and her mother's soft words of comfort. It reminded him painfully of Martha's last days. When Doc Harrison emerged, his expression was grim, but hopeful. "It's pneumonia, but we caught it early. With the right medicine and care, she should pull through. But Mary, you need to understand, this is going to be expensive." Mary Williams straightened, and Jake saw the same pride in her posture that he recognized in himself. "We'll find a way, Doctor. Tom and I, will work something out." "Actually," Jake said, surprising himself with his own words, "I was thinking I might be able to help with that." Both Mary and Doc Harrison turned to stare at him. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks, but pressed on. "My fence line runs pretty close to your property, Mrs. Williams. I've been meaning to extend it, and I could use some help with the work. If Tom's interested, I'd be willing to pay him enough to cover the medical expenses." It wasn't entirely a lie. Jake had been considering extending his fence, though it wasn't urgent, and Tom Williams had a reputation as a skilled hand with tools and lumber. Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Morrison, that's very kind, but I'm not sure Tom would want to accept charity." "It's not charity," Jake said firmly. "It's work. Fair wages for fair labor. If Tom's too proud to accept help, then maybe he's not as smart as I took him for." By the time they rode back down the mountain, Jake had committed himself to paying for Sarah's medicine and hiring Tom Williams for 2 weeks of fence work. It would cost him more than he'd originally planned, but as he thought about the relief in Mary's eyes and the sound of Sarah's breathing, already seeming a little easier, he found he didn't mind. That evening Jake sat at his kitchen table again, the wedding dress spread before him. But now, instead of seeing only the damage and decay, he found himself noticing the careful craftsmanship in the lacework, the delicate beauty of the pearl buttons, the way the silk caught and held the lamplight. It was still beautiful, even still worth preserving, even if it would never be worn again. Maybe the same could be said for other things, other dreams that had been abandoned too quickly, other possibilities that had been dismissed without proper consideration. Jake had spent 15 years convinced that his chance for happiness had died with Martha, that love was a luxury he could no longer afford, that opening his heart again would only lead to more pain. But today, seeing the gratitude in Mary Williams' eyes, feeling the satisfaction of being able to help when help was needed, he wondered if he'd been wrong. Martha was gone, and no amount of wishing would bring her back, but that didn't mean Jake's life had to be over too. The wedding dress in front of him was damaged beyond repair, but it was still beautiful, still meaningful, still capable of inspiring hope and dreams of the future. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from life and start living it again. Tom Williams showed up at Jake's ranch the following Monday, hat in hand, and pride carefully held in check. He was a tall, lean man with calloused hands, and the kind of quiet dignity that came from facing hardship without surrendering to it. "Mr. Morrison," he said, meeting Jake's eyes squarely, "my wife tells me you have some fence work that needs doing." "That's right," Jake replied. "North pasture needs extending, and there's some repair work on the existing line. It's honest work, but it's hard work." "I'm not afraid of hard work." They shook hands, and Jake felt the firm grip of a man who understood the value of labor. Over the next 2 weeks,
Tom proved himself to be everything Jake had hoped: skilled, reliable, and willing to put in long hours to earn his pay. More than that, he turned out to be good company. It had been years since Jake had worked alongside another man, years since he'd had someone to share the small satisfactions of a job well done, or the frustration of a stubborn fence post. Tom had opinions about cattle and horses, stories about his time in the mines, and a dry sense of humor that caught Jake off guard more than once. "You know," Tom said one afternoon, as they stretched wire along a particularly challenging section of hillside, "Mary's been after me to tell you how grateful we are.
Not just for the work, but for the way you handled it. A lot of men would have just handed over the money and expected us to be grateful for their charity." Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise. A man's got a right to earn his way. That he does. But not every man understands that. Tom secured the wire to a post and tested the tension. "Sarah's doing much better, by the way. Doc Harrison says she should be back on her feet within the week." "That's good news." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally Tom spoke again. "Mary's been wondering if you might like to come for dinner sometime. Nothing fancy, just a way to say thank you." Jake's first instinct was to decline. He'd spent so many years avoiding social entanglements that isolation had become a habit. But something made him hesitate. Maybe the memory of Martha's wedding dress, or the realization that he'd enjoyed Tom's company more than he'd expected. "That's kind of her," he said slowly. "Maybe when the fence work is finished." When Tom left at the end of the 2 weeks, Jake found himself missing the company. The ranch seemed quieter than usual, the work more solitary. He'd grown accustomed to having someone to talk to during the long days, someone who understood the rhythm of ranch life and the satisfaction of building something lasting. True to his word, Jake had dinner with the Williams family the following Sunday. Sarah was pale but smiling, clearly on the mend. Mary had prepared a feast despite their limited resources, and the small cabin was warm with the kind of contentment that came from a crisis weathered and overcome. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said shyly as they sat down to eat, "Mama says you helped save my life." Jake felt his cheeks burn. "Doc Harrison did the saving. I just helped with the paying." "Well, thank you anyway. When I grow up I want to help people the way you helped us." It was a simple statement from a child, but it hit Jake with unexpected force. When had he stopped thinking about helping people? When had he become so focused on protecting himself that he'd forgotten the satisfaction that came from reaching out to others? The evening passed pleasantly, filled with good food and easy conversation. When it came time to leave, Mary pressed a wrapped bundle into Jake's hands. "Just a little something," she said. "I noticed your shirts could use some mending." At home, Jake unwrapped the bundle to find 3 of his work shirts, carefully mended and cleaned. The stitching was precise and nearly invisible, the kind of work that spoke of both skill and care. It had been years since anyone had taken such trouble over his comfort. That night, Jake found himself thinking about Martha's wedding dress again. He'd wrapped it carefully and stored it in the chest in his bedroom, but he could still picture every detail. The careful construction, the loving attention to each element, the way it had been created not just as a garment but as a symbol of hope and commitment. Maybe it was time to stop thinking of the dress as a reminder of what he'd lost, and start seeing it as a symbol of what was still possible. Autumn deepened into winter, and Jake found his life settling into new patterns. He continued to work his ranch with the same dedication as always, but he also found time for small acts of kindness that would have seemed foreign to him just months before. He helped Doc Harrison with other families who couldn't afford medical care. He shared his expertise with younger ranchers who were struggling to establish themselves. He even attended church occasionally, something he hadn't done since Martha's death. The townspeople noticed the change, though they were too polite to comment directly. Jake Morrison had always been respected, but now he was becoming something more. A man people turned to for help, a neighbor they were glad to have. Spring arrived with its usual flourish of wildflowers and newborn calves. Jake was busier than ever, but it was a different kind of busy, purposeful rather than desperate, connected rather than isolated. He'd hired Tom Williams for seasonal work, and the two men had developed an easy partnership that benefited both their families. It was on a warm afternoon in May that Jake made his decision about the wedding dress. He'd been cleaning out the barn, finally ready to make use of the space he'd abandoned for so long. The structure was sound, just as he'd known it would be, requiring only basic repairs to make it functional again. As he worked, he found himself thinking about Martha's dreams for the barn, the hopes she'd invested in every beam and board. She'd wanted it to be a place of life and productivity, a symbol of their growing family and expanding future. Instead, it had become a monument to loss, a reminder of dreams unfulfilled. But maybe it didn't have to stay that way. That evening, Jake carefully unwrapped Martha's wedding dress and spread it on his kitchen table one more time. The silk was still fragile, the lace still torn, but in the lamplight it seemed to glow with a soft radiance that spoke of possibilities rather than endings. Jake had never been much of a hand with needle and thread, but he'd learned basic mending from necessity over the years. Working slowly and carefully, he began to repair what damage he could. The tears in the lace were beyond his skill, but he could reinforce the weakened seams and replace the most damaged buttons. It was painstaking work requiring patience and attention to detail that reminded him of the craftsmanship he'd put into building the barn. When he finished, the dress wasn't perfect, the repairs were visible, and some of the damage was permanent, but it was whole again, functional, beautiful in its own weathered way, just like Jake himself. The next morning, he loaded the dress carefully into his wagon and drove to town. His destination was the small dress shop run by Miss Patterson, a widow who had a reputation for fine needlework and discretion. "Mr. Morrison," she said, surprised to see him. "What can I do for you?" Jake carefully unwrapped the wedding dress, watching Miss Patterson's eyes widen as she took in the delicate craftsmanship and obvious age of the garment. "This was my wife's," he said simply. "I was wondering if you might be able to restore it properly, make it suitable for wearing again." Miss Patterson lifted the dress gently, examining the fabric and construction with the eye of an expert. "It's beautiful work," she murmured. "The lace is French, I think, and the silk is of exceptional quality. The damage is extensive." She looked up at Jake, curiosity clear in her expression. "May I ask what you plan to do with it?" Jake had been dreading this question, knowing it would require him to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. "I thought maybe someone else might want to wear it someday. Someone who could appreciate what it represents." Mrs. Patterson studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "I think I understand. Yes, Mr. Morrison, I believe I can restore this dress. It won't be exactly as it was, some changes will have to be made to accommodate the damage, but it can be beautiful again. That's all I'm asking for." Jake left the dress shop feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight he'd been carrying, the burden of guilt and grief and self-imposed isolation, seemed to have lifted with the wedding dress. He wasn't abandoning Martha's memory by allowing the dress to live again. He was honoring it. Over the following weeks, as Mrs. Patterson worked her magic on the dress, Jake found himself paying more attention to the life going on around him. He noticed that Sarah Williams had completely recovered from her illness and was back to her usual spirited self. He observed that Tom and Mary seemed happier, more secure now that Tom had steady work and Sarah was healthy. He also noticed that Doc Harrison's niece, Elizabeth, had arrived from Denver for an extended visit. Elizabeth Harrison was nothing like Martha. Where Martha had been dark and vivacious, Elizabeth was fair and quietly thoughtful. She was older than Martha had been when they met, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of practical intelligence that came from facing life's challenges without losing hope. She helped her uncle with his medical practice, proving herself capable of handling everything from setting broken bones to delivering babies. Jake first encountered her at the church social, where she was organizing a fundraising effort to buy books for the school. She approached him with the directness of a woman who had learned not to waste time on social niceties. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you're one of the more successful ranchers in the area. We're trying to raise money for the school library, and I was hoping you might consider making a contribution." Jake found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her gray eyes and the determined set of her chin. "What kind of books are you looking to buy?" "Practical ones, mostly. Books about agriculture and animal husbandry, basic mathematics and science. These children need to learn skills that will help them make a living, not just recite poetry." It was a sensible approach,
and Jake respected her for it. "I'll make a contribution," he said, "but I'd like to suggest some specific titles if that's all right. Books that might actually be useful to ranch families." Elizabeth's smile transformed her entire face. "That would be wonderful. Would you have time to discuss it this week?" And so began a series of conversations that Jake found himself looking forward to with an eagerness that surprised him. Elizabeth proved to be well informed about a wide range of subjects, from the latest developments in cattle breeding to the political situation back east. She was also genuinely interested in his opinions, asking thoughtful questions about ranching techniques and the challenges of frontier life. She wasn't Martha. Jake was careful not to make that comparison, but she was intelligent, kind, and possessed of the kind of quiet strength that Jake had come to value. Most importantly, she seemed to see something in him worth cultivating, treating him not as the isolated mourner he'd become, but as the man he was capable of being. When Mrs. Patterson finished restoring the wedding dress, Jake was almost afraid to look at it, but when he unwrapped the package in his kitchen, he gasped in amazement. The dress was transformed, still recognizably Martha's, but renewed and refreshed. The damaged lace had been replaced with complementary patterns, the weakened silk reinforced with nearly invisible patches. It looked ready for another wedding, another chance at happiness. Jake carefully rewrapped the dress and placed it back in the chest in his bedroom. He wasn't ready to give it away yet, might never be ready, but knowing that it could be worn again, that it could be part of another woman's dreams and hopes, filled him with a satisfaction he hadn't expected. Summer arrived with its usual intensity, bringing long days of hard work and the constant demands of ranch life. But Jake no longer faced these challenges alone. Tom Williams had become more than an employee, he was a true partner, helping Jake expand the operation and improve the quality of his herd. Elizabeth Harrison continued to visit, sometimes bringing her uncle on medical calls, sometimes simply stopping by to continue their ongoing conversations about books and ranching, and the future of their growing community. One evening in late July, as Jake and Elizabeth sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, she said something that made his heart skip. "I've been thinking about staying in Cedar Ridge permanent. Uncle Henry needs the help, and I've grown fond of this place. It feels like home in a way Denver never did." Jake felt a flutter of possibility, a sense of doors opening that he'd thought were permanently closed. "That would be good for the town," he said carefully. "And for your uncle?" Elizabeth smiled, and Jake thought he saw something hopeful in her expression. "Yes," she said quietly, "good for the town." As autumn approached again, Jake found himself thinking often about the wedding dress hidden in his bedroom. It was beautiful now, ready for whatever future awaited it, just like Jake himself, scarred by the past, but renewed and ready for whatever came next. The old barn stood solid and functional once again, filled with hay and housing his growing herd of horses. The space that had once been a monument to loss had become what Martha had always intended, a symbol of life and productivity and hope for the future. Sometimes when the light was just right and the wind whispered through the rafters, Jake could almost hear Martha's laughter echoing in the empty spaces. Not the sound of a ghost haunting him, but the memory of a woman who had loved him enough to want him to be happy, even without her. And for the first time in 15 years, Jake Morrison was beginning to believe that happiness might still be possible. The wedding dress in his bedroom chest was ready when the time came, and perhaps, someday, it would fall from the rafters again, not as a reminder of loss, but as a promise of love renewed.